The storm hits faster than anyone expects, and the camp shift from campfire smoke to emergency whistles in seconds. Kids run toward the mess hall. Counselors shout names over the wind, and rain turns the ground into mud under flashing lights. One counselor lingers by the lake instead of heading inside, staring at the pier as thunder rolls closer. A flashlight beam sweeps across the shoreline, then disappears. Later, when the storm clears, the pier is damaged, the lake is calm again, and one bunk is empty. No footprints, no phone, no answers. Only a jacket found near splintered wood and a note soaked through. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the distant hills, casting a golden haze over the peaceful summer camp nestled along the lake's edge. It had been an idyllic day, the kind that most people would describe as picture-perfect. The air was warm, and the sound of laughter echoed to the woods, bouncing off the trees and mixing with the chirps of crickets. The camp's counselors were scattered around, preparing for another night of campfire stories and songs, their faces bathed in the soft, amber light. But amidst all this calm, there was a feeling, subtle at first, then creeping slowly into the consciousness of the group, that something was amiss. Among the counselors was Sarah, a young woman whose presence seemed to bring the camp to life. Her smile was infectious, always the first to reassure a nervous camper or break into laughter at a joke, no matter how corny. To the children she helped guide, Sarah wasn't just a counselor. She was a friend, a mentor, a guiding light. They gravitated toward her, drawn to the warmth she exuded, like moths to a flame. There was something about her that made you feel safe, like the world outside the campgrounds didn't matter. Inside the camp, there was just a here and now. And in that here and now, Sarah was always present. But on this particular evening, as the evening sky gradually darkened and the first star of the night appeared in the dusky blue sky, Sarah felt a gnawing emptiness inside her, a weight she couldn't explain. She had always been one to push away her own feelings, to bottle them up and focus on others. But tonight, there was something different. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She stood by the lake's edge, the cool breeze rustling her hair as she watched the reflection of the sky ripple across the water. The lake had always been her place of solace, a place to collect her thoughts, to just be. But tonight, even the water felt different. It was darker than usual, almost as though it was hiding something beneath its surface. She tried to ignore the unsettling thought, brushing it aside as nothing more than a product of an overactive imagination. The storm that had been predicted earlier that day was still many hours away, or so everyone thought. The weather had been erratic lately, but nothing to be alarmed about. The clouds on the horizon were a mere suggestion of rain, the kind that would come and go before the evening festivities even began. So when Sarah heard the first distant rumble of thunder, it caught her off guard, though she tried not to show it. The campers were already starting to gather around the fire pit, and the counselors were preparing the marshmallow sticks. Everything felt ordinary, like another summer night at camp. Yet, as Sarah stood by the water, her mind wandered back to a conversation she had overheard earlier that day. A group of counselors had been talking about strange things that didn't seem to belong in the world of summer camp. Sarah had tried to focus on other conversations, but the words had lingered in her mind, rattling around like stones in a jar. One of them, a friend of hers, had mentioned a similar storm a year before, how it had come out of nowhere, and with it, something unsettling had happened at the pier. Sarah had been working at the camp that year too, but the memory seemed distant now. She couldn't remember the details, only that something had felt wrong about the storm, something she couldn't explain. She shook her head, dismissing the thought as nothing more than superstition. This storm would be like any other. But as the minutes ticked by and the first gust of wind began to pick up, Sarah couldn't shake the growing unease that gnawed at her. She knew that feeling well, that inexplicable dread that had always been present in the back of her mind whenever something wasn't quite right. Something was off. She could feel it deep in her bones. But what? The wind began to howl louder, and the first heavy raindrops started to fall, splashing against the lake's surface with sharp, audible cracks. The camp was thrown into a frenzy of last-minute preparations. Counselors scrambled to gather the children and usher them into the shelter of the mess hall, while others rushed to secure equipment and close windows. In the midst of it all, Sarah remained at the edge of the lake, her heart racing. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and a chill swept over her despite the warmth of the summer evening. She had always loved storms, the way they electrified the air, how they forced everything to slow down and pay attention. But this one was different. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. It was James, another counselor, a close friend from the previous year. He stood a few feet away, his expression one of mild concern as he shouted over the rising wind. "Sarah, the storm's picking up. You should get inside. It's going to be bad." She nodded, her lips pulling into a tight smile, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'll be in soon," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "Just need a minute." James didn't press further. He knew Sarah well enough to recognize when she needed space, and he didn't want to intrude on her quiet moments. He gave her a quick nod and turned to join the others heading inside. But as Sarah watched him go, something about his back, the way his shoulders hunched against the wind, reminded her of something she couldn't place. Seconds later, Sarah turned back to the lake. The storm had arrived in full force now, the wind gusting with so much strength it felt like it could tear the trees from their roots. The sound of rain hitting the ground was deafening, but still, Sarah stood there, lost in thought, watching the wild chaos of nature unfold before her. It was at that moment, as the first wave of the storm hit in earnest, that Sarah made a decision. It was a small, almost insignificant decision, one that would have been dismissed by anyone else. She turned and walked away from the lake, heading toward the mess hall, where the rest of the camp was taking shelter. But as she walked, a strange, inexplicable impulse tugged at her. She turned again, looking back toward the lake, toward the pier that jutted out into the water. It looked eerie, distorted in the storm's fury, but there was something about it that called to her. For a moment, she stood still, the wind whipping around her, and then she turned back and walked toward the pier. It was a decision she couldn't explain, an instinct she couldn't articulate. She was halfway there when the first flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The camp's emergency sirens wailed, and the counselors inside the mess hall screamed for everyone to hurry inside. But Sarah was already gone. By the time anyone realized she wasn't there, the storm had fully engulfed the camp. The counselors were scrambling to find shelter, and in the chaos, no one noticed her absence. It was hours later, when the rain began to subside and the wind settled into a softer breeze, that anyone thought to look for Sarah. They searched the camp, calling her name, but found nothing. No sign of her in the mess hall, no trace of her near the cabins. The pier, where she'd been seen heading, stood empty and silent, the storm's aftermath washing away any trace of her presence. It was only when the search grew desperate, when the frantic calls for her name had turned into worried, hushed whispers, that the truth began to settle in. Sarah was gone. There had been no struggle, no footprints leading away from the pier, no sign of her anywhere, just an empty camp, a camp that was forever changed by a storm that had come and gone, but left something far more unsettling in its wake. It was only the beginning. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the lingering scent of wet earth and the rhythmic sound of rainwater trickling down gutters. The camp was eerily still. What had once been a place full of laughter, games, and chatter now felt unnaturally quiet, as though the storm had taken something with it, something that had yet to be named. At first, no one noticed Sarah was missing. In the chaos of securing the camp and ushering the children into shelter, her absence went unnoticed. The counselors had all been preoccupied with keeping the campers safe, their attention split between calming frightened children and preparing for the worst. The storm had been so sudden, its intensity so overwhelming, that no one had time to track Sarah's movements closely. The camp had fallen into a sort of disarray, as if the storm had knocked not just the trees and the tents, but something deeper, something harder to define. The storm had affected everyone, but in different ways. It wasn't until hours later, when the wind had died down to a whisper and the campfire had been rekindled inside the mess hall, that someone realized Sarah was missing. The camp staff had settled into a hesitant normalcy, speaking in low voices about the storm's damage, discussing who would help with repairs in the morning. But no one had seen Sarah. At first, they assumed she'd gone to check on something, maybe taken shelter elsewhere to avoid the worst of the storm's fury. But when no one found her, and when no one remembered exactly when they'd last seen her, The small tendrils of worry began to unfurl in the minds of counselors. Her absence, initially thought to be nothing more than a small oversight, soon started to feel like something far more sinister. There was an unease in the air, something that didn't belong in the familiar world of summer camp, where the worst thing that ever happened was the occasional scraped knee or homesick camper. The first counselor to speak up was Emily, a close friend of Sarah's from the previous year. She had been the one to see Sarah last, or so she thought. But now, as she racked her memory, she couldn't remember exactly when that had been. "I thought she was with us when we came inside," Emily said, her voice quivering. She had always been the organized one, the reliable one, but now she wasn't sure of anything. They'd all been so frantic, running to help the children. Maybe Sarah had gotten lost in the shuffle. Maybe she had just wandered off to the edge of camp to check the damage from the storm. But the more Emily thought about it, the more something didn't sit right. She could feel the gnawing panic rising in her chest, the quiet whisper that something wasn't right. Why hadn't Sarah come inside? Why hadn't anyone noticed she was missing? The camp counselors began to search the grounds, calling Sarah's name into the stillness of night, their voices sounding too small and insignificant against the vastness of the empty camp. The wind had died down, but the air was thick with the weight of uncertainty, and the distant sound of the camp's emergency siren still rang in their ears. No one spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. There was a sense among them all that something had shifted, something unseen but undeniable. As the hours stretched on and the camp slowly settled into a tense quiet, the search parties were organized. A few counselors went to the pier, while others combed the cabins and the camp's wooded areas. The sense of dread grew with each passing minute, each unsuccessful attempt to find Sarah. The campers, now tucked into their bunks, whispered quietly among themselves, their faces pale and confused. It was the first time that any of them had ever experienced anything like this gnawing feeling of something amiss, the uncertainty that hovered like a shadow in the corners of their minds. The counselors moved through the camp in a detached haze, no longer joking or laughing. Every footstep felt too loud, every crack of branch underfoot too jarring. Their search was mechanical, each person moving as though on autopilot, their minds consumed by the terrifying realization that something was wrong, something was missing, but no one could figure out exactly what. By the time the clock had struck midnight, the camp had fallen into a strange and unnerving stillness. The storm had passed, but its presence lingered like an aftershock that hadn't quite subsided. The air felt heavy with unspoken questions, and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind was the only sound that kept them tethered to reality. And still, no one had found Sarah. The counselors had no choice but to notify the authorities. The town sheriff was called, and a handful of officers arrived with flashlights, their faces etched with concern. The presence of the law seemed to heighten the sense of urgency, but it also made everything feel more real, more dangerous. A camp counselor, missing in the middle of the storm, was no longer just a case of a lost camper. It was something darker, something that couldn't easily be explained away. As the officers arrived, Emily found herself standing by the lake, staring at the pier. The wooden beams groaned under the strain of the storm, some of them half submerged in the rising water, while others had been split and torn apart by the ferocity of the wind. She could see the jagged edges where the dock had once been whole, a reminder of the storm's raw power. But what caught her attention wasn't the destruction, it was the stillness. The pier was empty, the water beneath it eerily calm. There was no sign of Sarah, no sign of any struggle, nothing that would explain her disappearance. Just an empty pier, lost in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The sheriff's team began a more thorough search of the area, dividing into teams to comb the nearby woods and the cabins. The searchlights cut through the dark, their beams harsh against the night. Every counselor and officer felt like they were walking through a nightmare, the edges of reality blurring as they tried to make sense of what had happened. But no matter where they looked, there were no signs, no clues. Sarah had simply vanished. It was as though the storm itself had swallowed her whole. At first, they believed she might have gone for a walk in the woods. Maybe she had been startled by the storm and sought refuge in the trees, hoping to avoid the worst of it. The more the counselors thought about it, the more they wondered if she had somehow gotten caught in the storm's fury, disoriented and lost in the dark. But the longer the search continued without any trace of her, the more impossible that theory seemed. There were no footprints leading away from the pier, no sign of a struggle. The campgrounds were flat and open. Sarah couldn't have just disappeared into the night without leaving a trace. As dawn broke over the horizon, the sense of dread that had been building since the storm's arrival began to settle into something more permanent. The officers, exhausted from hours of searching, began to coordinate with the local authorities and call in additional search teams. But the more they searched, the less sense it all made. Sarah's absence was not just a mystery, it was an enigma. She had been at the camp only hours before, laughing, talking, living, and now she was gone. And with her disappearance, the camp, once full of life, had become a place of heavy silence and palpable fear. No one knew where Sarah had gone, but everyone could feel the weight of the uncertainty hanging over them. What had happened in the storm? Had Sarah simply wandered off? Had something more sinister occurred? The questions were endless, and with each passing hour, they seemed to grow heavier. The storm may have passed, but the real storm, the one that would forever alter the lives of those at the camp, had only just begun. Days passed in a haze of uncertainty, the camp slowly losing its pulse, its rhythm, as the search for Sarah continued with no progress. The storm, which had raged with such intensity, was now a distant memory, but its aftermath lingered in the air, a kind of quiet dread that infected everything. It wasn't just the absence of Sarah, it was a feeling that something larger, something more sinister, had settled over the camp. The counselors, once energetic and full of life, now moved like shadows, their faces drawn with exhaustion and anxiety. Conversations, once full of laughter and banter, had become sparse, strained, and uncomfortable. They tried to reassure the campers, to maintain the illusion of normalcy, but it was slipping through their fingers, just like the hope that Sarah would be found. The campers, too, began to feel it. They could sense the unease in the air, the subtle shift in the way the counselors looked at one another, the whispers that never quite reached their ears, but that they could still feel hanging in the corners of the mess hall. It was a kind of fear that a child doesn't understand but feels deeply nonetheless. The camp, which was once a place of laughter and light, had become a place of fear and dread. The sight of empty bunks where Sarah should have been, the absence of her warm smile, had turned the camp into a hollow shell. It was as if the very soul of the camp had been ripped out, leaving behind only the cold, sterile echo of what it used to be. The search teams were relentless, and yet the trail grew colder with each passing hour. Local authorities had enlisted the help of search dogs, combing through the woods and the surrounding area, but there was nothing, no sign of Sarah. The lake, once a source of beauty and serenity, was now a dark, murky abyss. No one had dared to approach it again, except for the few investigators who had been assigned to scour its depths. They had hoped to find something, anything, that could lead them to Sarah. But all they found was an eerie silence beneath the surface, broken only by the occasional ripple caused by the wind. Theories began to swirl among the counselors. Some, shaken and fearful, wondered if Sarah had somehow become disoriented during the storm, wandered too far, and was now lost somewhere in the woods, hidden by the thick trees and the dense underbrush. But that didn't sit well with them, not entirely. There had been no sign of her anywhere on the grounds. No footprints leading away from the camp, no broken branches or disturbed soil. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Others began to entertain darker possibilities. What if someone had taken her? What if there was something more sinister at work here, something that they hadn't noticed before? The idea was whispered among the counselors late at night when they sat in the mess hall, trying to make sense of it all. Sarah had always been a figure of light, of warmth. She had never shown signs of distress, of wanting to leave or disappear. So why now? Why on this night, when the storm had taken everything else with it, had she chosen to vanish? But there was something that none of them were prepared to face. The possibility that Sarah had not disappeared at all, that she had made a decision, a conscious decision, to leave, to walk away from everything she knew. It was an impossible thought, one that no one wanted to entertain. After all, Sarah had been beloved by everyone at the camp. She had no enemies, no secret conflicts, no reason to run away. Or so they thought. The days turned into weeks, and the investigation seemed to stall, caught in a spiral of unanswered questions and endless dead ends. The authorities had scoured the area, questioned everyone at the camp, and even examined the few belongings Sarah had left behind. Her bag, her jacket, her journal. But there was nothing that could point to where she had gone or why. The note that had been found in her bag, written in her handwriting but cryptic and strange, only added to the confusion. The message was brief, filled with vague references to things and people that no one seemed to recognize. It felt like a puzzle piece that didn't fit, a key to a door that no one knew how to open. As the investigation dragged on, the camp began to change. It was no longer a place of carefree joy. The tension in the air had become palpable, like an invisible weight pressing down on everyone who passed through the camp's gates. The counselors who had once been Sarah's closest friends began to drift apart, each consumed by their own doubts and fears. Some turned inward, avoiding the others as if afraid that their own questions might somehow reveal their guilt. Others became restless, unable to bear the silence, the constant presence of a mystery that threatened to swallow them whole. Emily, Sarah's closest friend at the camp, was particularly affected. She had been the last person to see Sarah, the last person to hear her laugh, to see her smile. The memory of it haunted her, replaying over and over in her mind like an echo that refused to fade. She spent her days searching for answers, her mind running in endless circles as she tried to piece together the fragments of what she had seen that night, of what she had felt. But the more she searched, the more elusive the answer became. It was as if the truth was slipping through her fingers, like sand in the wind. One night, after a long day of searching the woods once again, Emily found herself standing by the lake. The water was still, the moon reflecting off its surface, like a ghostly mirror. It was the same lake where Sarah had disappeared, the place that had once felt so comforting, so safe. Now it felt oppressive, suffocating. Emily's thoughts swirled, and for a moment, she thought she saw Sarah's face in the water, staring up at her from the depths. But when she blinked, it was gone. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words slipping out like a prayer. "Where are you?" She stared at the water, waiting for something, anything, that could explain the emptiness she felt. But the lake remained silent, as it had for days. There were no answers, no sign of Sarah, only the oppressive weight of the unknown. Emily wasn't the only one consumed by the mystery. The other counselors had begun to change as well. James, Sarah's friend and fellow counselor, seemed to withdraw more with each passing day. He had always been the strong, steady one, the one who kept things together when everything else fell apart. But now, his demeanor was darker, more distant. It was as if the weight of the search had cracked something inside him, something that he couldn't put back together. He spent long hours in the woods, searching for clues that weren't there, retracing steps that had already been covered. The other counselors noticed it, but no one knew how to help him, or if he even wanted help. The silence that hung between them all was more than just the absence of Sarah. It was the absence of connection, of trust, as though the very fabric of the camp had been torn apart by something unseen. As the weeks stretched on, Emily found herself growing more and more convinced that the camp itself held the answers. It was as if the place, the land, had absorbed something dark, something sinister, that no one had been able to see before. The storm had uncovered more than just physical damage. It had uncovered cracks in the foundation, fractures in the stories they had all told themselves about the safety of their little camp, about the certainty of their lives. But the more Emily searched, the more she realized that no one was prepared to face what had happened, not to face the possibility that Sarah hadn't simply wandered off, or been swept away by the storm, not to face the possibility that Sarah had been running from something far darker than they had imagined. And as the search for her slowed to a halt, the camp became a hollow shell, filled with the ghosts of what once was. The unanswered questions, the unspoken fears, had become the only things left behind. The discovery came unexpectedly, in the aftermath of a rainstorm that had left the camp battered and broken, but still standing, just as Sarah had been just days before. The storm, once a harbinger of chaos, had passed, and with its passing, something strange had begun to unfold. It was as if the weather had unearthed more than just physical debris. What was once hidden had been revealed, and what had seemed like an ordinary part of the landscape now held dark implications. The storm had left its mark on the camp. The pier, a long wooden structure that jutted out over the lake, had always been a place of quiet reflection for many. It was where Sarah had spent her moments of solitude, where the noise of the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the peaceful ripples of the water. But now, the pier stood broken, battered by the wind, with half of its planks missing, the structure itself almost unrecognizable. It looked fragile, a remnant of something once sturdy, something solid that had been pulled apart by nature's force. The pier had always been a symbol of the camp's connection to the lake, a bridge between campers' lives and the vast, unknown waters that lay beneath. But now, as the counselors gathered to assess the damage, there was something deeply unsettling about the way the pier had been torn apart. It wasn't just the obvious destruction, the gaping holes in wood or the broken beams. No, it was something else, something hidden, something that didn't belong. James, who had been acting more withdrawn in the days following Sarah's disappearance, was the one to make the discovery. He had been one of the first to arrive at the pier to inspect the damage, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The camp had been searching for clues for weeks, but nothing had come up. The deeper they looked, the more they realized how little they actually knew. There had been no footprints, no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken branches, nothing that pointed to what had happened. But this felt different. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. A small object caught his eye, wedged between the broken pieces of the pier, half buried in the debris. James knelt down, his breath caught in his throat. The object, partially obscured by splintered wood and silt, was unmistakable. It was Sarah's jacket, her worn, faded jean jacket that she had worn every day since she arrived at the camp, the one that always smelled faintly of campfire smoke, of long days spent outdoors. There, amidst the ruins of the pier, it lay, untouched but strangely out of place. For a moment, James stood frozen, the realization of what he had found washing over him like a wave. His mind raced, jumping from one thought to another, unable to settle on any one. Sarah's jacket had been in her possession just hours before the storm. She had been wearing it when they last saw her, and now, here it was, beneath the wreckage of the pier, as though it had been deliberately placed there. His heart pounded in his chest as he carefully reached down and retrieved the jacket, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. It wasn't torn, nor was it in any way damaged, but there was something unnerving about the way it had been discarded. It wasn't just an item left behind. It felt like a message, an artifact from a moment that didn't make sense, one that was just as elusive and cryptic as Sarah's disappearance itself. The jacket felt like a ghost of what once was, a tangible trace of the person who had vanished into thin air. James, holding the jacket in his hands, began to look around the area with a newfound sense of urgency. The pier, once a place of calm, now felt like an ominous ruin. He felt as though it were watching him, waiting for him to uncover whatever secret it was hiding. His eyes scanned the surrounding area, tracing the edges of the wreckage, hoping for a clue, a sign, anything that could explain why Sarah's jacket had ended up here, hidden beneath the twisted wood. It was then that he noticed something else, something that made his stomach drop. Just a few feet away from where he stood, partially submerged in the mud, was a small piece of paper, barely visible beneath the surface. He knelt down, his breath hitching, and gently pulled out, the paper crinkling in his hands as he unfolded it. The writing was familiar. It was Sarah's handwriting, but the words were a jumbled mess, difficult to decipher at first. The note, written hastily, contained only a few cryptic sentences. The first was a simple sentence that made James's pulse quicken. "I didn't think it would come to this." That, on its own, was unsettling enough, but it was the second part of the note that threw him completely off guard. It read, "The water will tell you. The truth is in the depths." James held the note in his hand for a long moment, his mind reeling with confusion. What did it mean? The water would tell them? The truth was in the depths? The idea of Sarah leaving behind such a cryptic message left him with more questions than answers. Was she planning to return? Had she somehow left this message for someone to find, hoping they would be able to uncover the truth behind her disappearance? Or was this some sort of plea, a final, desperate attempt to explain something too complicated, too painful to understand? The pier had once been a symbol of connection, of life at camp, of Sarah herself. Now, in the wake of the storm, it had become a symbol of something far darker. It had been torn apart by nature's fury, and in its wreckage, It had hidden Sarah's jacket and her cryptic note, like a secret buried beneath the surface. The pier, once a place of safety, had become a place of mystery, a place that held a secret so elusive that even the most seasoned investigators couldn't make sense of it. James stood for a long time, staring at the wreckage of the pier, the jacket in his hands, and the note crumpled in his pocket. It felt like he was standing at the edge of something much larger, something beyond his comprehension. He had thought he understood the mystery of Sarah's disappearance. He had assumed it was just a case of someone getting lost in the storm, someone disoriented by the chaos. But now, after finding the jacket and the note, he wasn't so sure. It felt as though they were on the brink of uncovering something far more complex, something much darker than anyone had anticipated. With the note and the jacket in his possession, James returned to the camp, the weight of what he had discovered pressing down on him with every step. He felt as though he had crossed a threshold, that something significant had been unlocked, but he wasn't sure what it was. The camp, which had once felt like home, now seemed unfamiliar, almost hostile. When he returned to the mess hall, the other counselors were waiting anxiously, their faces full of concern. They had seen him return, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the items in his grasp. He tried to explain what he had found, but his words seemed inadequate. Somehow, he showed them the jacket first, the familiar fabric that had once belonged to Sarah, and then he pulled out the note. The room fell silent as the counselors read the words. The cryptic message hung in the air like a question that no one had the answer to. What did it mean? Why had Sarah left it behind? The silence stretched on, each person lost in their own thoughts, unable to grasp the significance of the message. As the night wore on, it became clear that something had shifted. The discovery at the pier, Sarah's jacket, the note, had changed everything. It was no longer just about finding Sarah. It was about understanding why she had disappeared in the first place, and what had led her to leave behind such a strange, cryptic message. The counselors knew they had to go back to the pier. They had to go deeper, into the water, into the depths, if they ever hoped to uncover the truth. But as they prepared for the next stage of the search, one thing was certain. Whatever they found there, it was not going to be what they had expected. The air felt heavy the next morning, thick with anticipation, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The discovery of Sarah's jacket and the cryptic note had shifted everything. The camp, once bustling with the sound of children playing and counselors laughing, had been reduced to a strange, unsettling silence. The notes had been read, the jackets examined, but still the questions lingered. The note had been a message, but what did it mean? The water will tell you. The truth is in the depths. That was all it said. What truth was hidden beneath the water? What could possibly explain the disappearance of someone so integral to the camp, so loved by everyone? Someone who had never given any indication of wanting to leave. The counselors had no choice but to push forward, to return to the lake, to the place where the mystery had begun. James was the one to suggest it, his voice filled with a grim determination as he stood before the others. He could feel the weight of the discovery pressing on him, the feeling that something was just out of reach, something important, something he hadn't fully understood yet. He believed Sarah's message wasn't just a reflection of fear or panic. There was something intentional about it. There was a secret. It was hidden in the water, deep within the lake's murky depths. It was a truth that needed to be uncovered, a truth that Sarah had wanted them to find. But why? They gathered at the pier again, the wooden structure now even more dilapidated than before. The storm had left its mark, tearing the planks apart, leaving sharp edges exposed, the splinters glistening like broken teeth in the dim light of dawn. The camp had brought in a small group of divers and rescue personnel from the local community, but the decision to investigate the lake's depths wasn't one that came easily. No one knew what they might find down there, and the idea of disturbing the water's calm seemed almost sacrilegious. But they had to do it. The note had made it clear that the truth was in the depths, and they couldn't afford to ignore it any longer. James stood by the shore, his eyes scanning the water. The surface of the lake was calm, a mirror-like reflection of the sky above. It seemed serene, almost peaceful. But James knew better. He had spent enough time on the lake, both as a counselor and as a child himself, to know that this placid surface hid secrets. The lake had always felt ancient, its waters deep and unknowable, a place that felt like it belonged to a time long before the camp had ever been built. It was as if the lake had its own consciousness, its own quiet presence, watching over the camp, watching over everyone who came. And now, James couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was hiding something, something it kept for far too long. The divers suited up and entered the water, their movements deliberate, their expressions focused. They knew the stakes, and yet there was no avoiding the tension that hung in the air. Each of them knew the risks. They had no idea what they would find. There could be something dangerous down there, something hidden beneath the water that had nothing to do with Sarah at all. But the counselors had to know. They had to understand. The lake was the only place left to search. James watched as the divers sank beneath the surface, their figures vanishing into the dark waters below. The ripples from their entry spread out in circles, distorting the reflection of the trees along the shoreline, blurring the world into an abstract painting. The minutes stretched on, each one heavier than the last. The sky, once bright with the early morning sun, was now clouded, as if nature itself was uncertain about what was happening. It felt as though everything was waiting, holding its breath, like the world itself was suspended in time. The minutes turned into hours. The counselors watched anxiously from the shore, the silence almost unbearable. No one spoke, each person too consumed by their thoughts, their fears. It was as if they were all connected by this single moment, this single question. What was hidden beneath the lake? What was Sarah trying to tell them? Then, just as the light began to fade from the sky, the first diver surfaced, gasping for air, his eyes wide with shock. The counselors rushed forward, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What did you find?" James asked, his voice hoarse with anticipation. The diver's breath came in sharp bursts as he tried to steady himself. "You won't believe it," he said, his voice trembling. We found something, but it's not what we expected." The others leaned in closer, their minds racing, their hearts beating faster. What had he seen? What could be down there? "It's hard to explain," the diver continued, still catching his breath. "At first, we thought it was just debris from the storm, bits of wood and metal from the pier. But then we found something else. Something odd." He paused, looking at the others, as though trying to process what he had seen himself. "We found a bag. It was heavy, weighed down with something. When we pulled it up, we thought it was just a part of the wreckage. But then we opened it." The diver's voice cracked, his words faltering. It was full of personal items, Sarah's things. The counselors exchanged confused glances. Sarah's belongings? Down there in the lake? How could they have ended up in the water, buried beneath the wreckage of the pier? Her journal, the diver continued, his voice quieter now. Her favorite necklace. A few other things. All in the bag, weighted down, like she didn't want them to be found. Or like someone wanted them to be hidden. The words settled heavily on the counselors, who stood in stunned silence. The diver was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he pulled a small, waterlogged bag from his belt. Inside, the counselors could see the faint outline of a journal, a necklace, a few scraps of fabric. But there was something else in the bag, something that caught James's eye, a small, crumpled piece of paper. James reached forward and took the paper from the bag, his heart pounding in his chest. The paper was soaked, the edges curling from the water, but the writing on it was still legible. He unfolded it carefully, the weight of the moment settling over him. He didn't need to read it to know it was important. This was another message, another clue. The note was shorter than the first, but no less cryptic. It simply read, "The water keeps the secrets. Some things are better left undisturbed." James's breath caught in his throat as he read the words again and then again. "The water keeps the secrets." What did that mean? Why had Sarah written this? Had she left this behind? Or had someone else placed it there, hoping it would never be found? The other counselors crowded around him, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Emily, who had been with Sarah the longest, shook her head, as if trying to understand what had happened. "What is this? Why would she leave this behind?" She whispered, her voice trembling. "Why didn't she come back? Why didn't she come to us?" James didn't have an answer. He stared at the note, the words echoing in his mind. Some things are better left undisturbed. Was that what Sarah had been trying to tell them? Had she known something too dangerous, Too painful that she couldn't escape? The thought lingered like a shadow, hovering just out of reach. The divers had begun pulling more items from the lake. Sarah's belongings, her journal, her necklace. But the more they found, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. They had been searching for answers, but now it felt as though they were opening doors that they weren't ready to face, doors that would lead them into a darkness they couldn't understand. With each new discovery, the camp's once comforting sense of security had begun to crumble. The pieces of Sarah's life, her personal belongings, were no longer just items to be recovered. They were symbols of something much larger, something that couldn't be ignored. Sarah had left behind clues, but they were not easy to read. They weren't meant to be understood right away. The truth, it seemed, was more complicated than they had ever imagined. The truth was buried beneath the surface, hidden in the very water they thought was so calm. And the deeper they went, the less sure they were that they wanted to know what lay beneath. As the divers resurfaced one final time, the camp was left in stunned silence. They had found Sarah's things, yes, but they had also uncovered a message, a warning, that made the mystery even more confounding. The truth was in the depths, but some truths, it seemed, were better left buried. The weeks following the discovery of Sarah's belongings at the lake were marked by an unsettling stillness, a heavy quiet that permeated every corner of the camp. The thrill of the search had faded, replaced by a creeping sense of dread that no one could shake. The counselors were walking on eggshells, their minds clouded with the cryptic messages and the strange circumstances surrounding Sarah's disappearance. No one had the answers they were so desperately seeking, and yet each day seemed to raise more questions, deepening the mystery in ways they hadn't anticipated. James, who had once been sure that the water held a key to everything, now found himself consumed by doubt. He had believed that uncovering Sarah's belongings would lead them to the truth, but all they had found were fragments, pieces of a life that didn't seem to add up, clues that pointed in different directions but never quite converged. The note that had been found with Sarah's things. The water keeps the secrets. Some things are better left undisturbed. Weighed heavily on him. Was Sarah warning them away? Was she telling them not to dig any deeper, to leave the past buried where it belonged? And if so, why? What could she have known that was so dangerous, so terrifying, that she would rather disappear than confront it? It wasn't just a mystery of her disappearance that haunted him. It was a feeling that something was wrong, something more than just the storm and the chaos it had caused. He had come to the lake, hoping for answers, but instead, he felt more lost than ever. There was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach, a sense that something was being kept from him, something that no one dared to speak of. The camp had become a place of shadows, the familiar paths now foreign and unsettling. The counselors no longer gathered around the campfire at night to share stories or jokes. Instead, they huddled in small, tense groups, their conversations stilted and awkward, as though they were all trying to avoid the elephant in the room, the unanswered questions that seemed to hang between them. Even the campers, once oblivious to the darker currents beneath the surface, had begun to sense that something was amiss. They were quieter now, their laughter less frequent, their energy subdued. The camp, once vibrant with life, now felt like a place out of time, caught between the past and the future, as though it were waiting for something to happen, something inevitable. But the camp couldn't stay in limbo forever. They had to find Sarah. The authorities had done their part, investigating the lake, questioning the staff and the campers, and searching surrounding woods. But there had been no new leads, no new evidence, and the case was beginning to stall. With each passing day, the mystery of Sarah's disappearance seemed to slip further into the realm of the unsolvable, an enigma that might never be unraveled. And yet, despite the growing frustration, there was one person who couldn't let go: Emily. She had been Sarah's closest friend, the one who knew her best. She had seen Sarah laugh, seen her cry, shared late-night talks around the campfire, and watched as Sarah blossomed into one of the most beloved counselors the camp had ever seen. Emily couldn't accept that Sarah was just gone, that she had simply disappeared into the night. She couldn't accept that the trail had gone cold. The water, the pier, the cryptic notes, it all pointed to something. She was sure of it. The notes Sarah had left behind, the one that had been found in the waterlogged bag, had struck Emily the hardest. She read it again and again, trying to find some meaning in the words, try to understand the warning. The water keeps the secrets. What did that mean? Had Sarah been hiding something? Something too painful to confront? Or had she known something? Something about the camp, about the people around her, that she couldn't share? And if so, what had driven her to leave everything behind? The more Emily thought about it, the more she realized that the lake wasn't just a backdrop to the story. It was central to the mystery, to Sarah's disappearance. Sarah had been drawn to the lake, to the pier, to the very water that now seemed to hold her secrets. It was as if the lake had become a mirror, reflecting something hidden in the depths, something that Emily couldn't see, but felt deeply in her bones. Emily wasn't one to give up easily, and as the days dragged on, she found herself returning to the pier again and again. She couldn't explain it, but she felt compelled to go back, to search the water once more. There was something there, something she was missing. Each time she went, she felt as though she were getting closer, that the water was trying to tell her something, but it refused to speak. The sense of connection between Sarah and the lake was too strong to ignore. It felt as though Sarah's disappearance had been intertwined with the lake's silent depths, and Emily couldn't walk away from it. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, Emily stood on the edge of the pier, her fingers curling around the weathered wood. The air was thick with humidity, the oppressive silence of the night pressing in from all sides. The water was eerily still, a dark, glassy surface that seemed to stretch on forever, deep and unknowable. Emily's mind raced as she stared at the water, the ripples of her thoughts merging with the ripples on the surface. She couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was hiding something, that Sarah had left something behind in the depths. Just then, a figure approached from behind her, and Emily turned to see James walking toward her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that mirrored the confusion and the sorrow she had been carrying for weeks. He had been distant, preoccupied with his own thoughts, but tonight he seemed more present than he had in a long time. It was as if the weight of the mystery had finally caught up to him, and he was ready to confront it, no matter how dark it might get. "I've been thinking about the lake," he said quietly, standing beside her at the edge of the pier. "About Sarah, about the note, about everything." Emily nodded, her heart heavy. "I can't shake the feeling that it's all connected. The water, the pier, Sarah's disappearance. It's all part of something we don't understand. I think she knew something. I think she was trying to tell us." James looked at her, his face drawn with the exhaustion of weeks of fruitless searching. "I feel it too, but what if we're looking at this all wrong? What if we're missing something obvious? What if we've been asking the wrong questions all along?" Emily stared at the water, her mind racing. The wrong questions. What if they had been so focused on the obvious, on the things that seemed to make sense, that they had overlooked the deeper truth? Maybe they had been asking all the wrong questions. Maybe Sarah hadn't disappeared because of some external force. Maybe the answer was closer than they thought, buried in the very fabric of their lives at the camp, something they had taken for granted. "What if," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the realization, "what if Sarah didn't want us to find her? What if she chose this?" James turned to her, his eyes searching hers for some kind of understanding. "You mean she ran away? She just left everything behind?" Emily nodded, her heart sinking as she tried to wrap her mind around it. "I don't know, but it makes more sense than anything else. What if she was trying to escape? What if she knew something about the camp, something about us, that we didn't want to see? And what if the lake was the only way she could keep it hidden?" James fell silent, his gaze drifting to the water. The thought was almost too much to bear. Sarah, the bright, optimistic counselor who had been a constant source of light in the camp, had somehow felt trapped? What could have driven her to leave it all behind, to disappear into the night, leaving only cryptic messages and a trail of broken pieces? As the night stretched on and the stars began to emerge in the sky above, Emily and James stood side by side, lost in their thoughts. The lake, once a place of calm and peace, had become something more, a symbol of the unknown, of secrets buried deep beneath the surface. Whatever had happened to Sarah, whatever had driven her to vanish, was still a mystery. And the more they searched for answers, the more they realized that some truths were better left undisturbed. The days had blurred into one another as the camp continued its uneasy existence, suspended between hope and despair. The search for Sarah had, for all intents and purposes, reached its conclusion. The authorities, the divers, the counselors, each had poured their efforts into uncovering the truth, but every attempt had felt like an echo, a reverberation of a mystery that refused to be solved. The lake, which had once been a peaceful and serene body of water, had become a symbol of everything that was lost, a vast expanse of secrets and unanswered questions. Yet, even as the answers remained elusive, a sense of finality began to settle over the camp. The discovery of Sarah's belongings, the cryptic notes, and the haunting warnings from the lake itself were all that remained. Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Despite the outward calm, there was a restlessness within her, a gnawing sense that the pieces of the puzzle, however fragmented, still held a truth too terrible to be acknowledged. Something wasn't adding up. It had become apparent that Sarah hadn't simply vanished. She hadn't been swept away by the storm, nor had she been a victim of some random tragedy. The lake had kept its secrets for too long, and Emily was certain that she had to dive deeper, even if the depths were too dark to see. There was one place left untouched, one place that none of the counselors had dared to explore. It wasn't far from the pier, but it was a section of the woods that seemed untouched by the usual foot traffic, a part of the landscape that seemed to exist on the periphery of their awareness. Emily had always been vaguely aware of it, a stretch of forest that was dense with trees and overgrowth, but she had never given it much thought. It was an easy place to ignore, tucked away in a corner of the camp. But now, it seemed to pulse with a strange kind of energy, beckoning her, calling her to uncover whatever had been hidden there. She had returned to the lake so many times, only to find the same answers, or rather, the lack of them. It felt as though the lake was only a part of the story, and the rest lay elsewhere, just beyond reach. As she walked to the campgrounds, Emily's mind raced with the implications of the last few weeks. Each piece of evidence, each encounter, seemed to lead her back to one inescapable conclusion. Sarah hadn't just disappeared. She had been hiding. But why? What could she have been running from? Was it something in the camp? Something buried deep in the woods? The more Emily thought about it, the more she realized that there was a pattern in Sarah's behavior, one she hadn't seen before. It was subtle, a kind of withdrawal from the camp's usual routine. Sarah had always been a picture of dedication and enthusiasm, but in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Emily had noticed something in her eyes, something distant, something guarded. It wasn't the behavior of someone who was planning to leave. It was the behavior of someone who was being pushed to the edge, someone who was struggling to keep a part of themselves hidden from everyone around them. The day Emily decided to search the woods was unremarkable, the kind of day where everything felt the same, where the world seemed frozen in place. She had no particular plan in mind, just the urge to walk, to clear her mind, to find something, anything, that might point her in the right direction. The woods, dense and thick with foliage, had always felt like a safe haven for campers, a place to escape the noise of daily life, a sanctuary for moments of solitude. But now, the trees seemed to loom over her like sentinels, watching, waiting for her to uncover whatever they were guarding. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, their colors muted in the soft light of the late afternoon. Emily's footsteps were muffled by the blanket of decay beneath her, the ground giving slightly with each step. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though the very air was holding its breath. The trees around her stretched upward, their branches interlocking in a dense canopy above, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. It felt like she was moving through a world that was separate from the camp, a world that existed in parallel, just out of reach. The deeper Emily walked into the woods, the more she felt the weight of the past pressing on her. The events of the past few weeks seemed to haunt her, clinging to her like a fog. She couldn't help but wonder if she was wasting her time, if the answers she sought were buried too deeply to be uncovered. But there was something, some force, that pushed her forward, urging her to keep going, to dig deeper into the mystery that had taken hold of her. After what felt like hours, Emily found herself at the edge of a small clearing, the trees parting just enough to let in a sliver of sunlight. In the center of the clearing was an old structure, partially overgrown with ivy and moss, its wood faded and worn with time. It was a cabin, small, almost forgotten. Emily felt a jolt of recognition as she looked at it. She had seen this place before, though it had never registered as important until now. It had been tucked away at the far edge of the camp, a relic from a time long past. Most campers and staff had forgotten about it, treating it as little more than an eyesore. But now, standing before it, Emily realized it was more than just an old cabin. It was part of the story. It was part of Sarah's story. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, the wood creaking as it swayed with the breeze. Emily hesitated for a moment, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She had no idea what she might find inside or what the cabin might reveal, but she knew, in the deepest part of her soul, that she had to go in. This was the missing piece, the part of the story she had been searching for. There was no going back now. With a deep breath, Emily pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside of the cabin was dark, the only light filtering in from the crack in the door and a small window near the back. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, the remnants of a place that had long been abandoned. The floorboards creaked underfoot as she stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. At first, it seemed like just another forgotten place. But then, her eyes caught on something that made her breath catch in her throat. In the corner of the cabin, half hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, was a small box. It was an old wooden box, intricately carved, the wood smooth and dark with age. It didn't belong here, not in this forgotten cabin. It was too personal, too deliberate. Emily's fingers trembled as she reached down to pick it up. It was heavier than she expected, its weight pressing into her palms as if it held something more than just physical substance. As she opened the box, the contents spilled out in a delicate cascade. Papers, photographs, and a small notebook, worn with age and use. The photos were old black and white images that seemed to capture moments frozen in time. Some were of Sarah, as a child, others with friends she seemed to have lost touch with over the years. But the most striking photo was one that showed Sarah standing with another person, someone Emily didn't recognize. The person was partially obscured, their face hidden in shadow, but there was something unsettling about the photo, something about the way Sarah's smile didn't reach her eyes. Emily's pulse quickened as she sifted through the papers, her mind racing. Each document seemed to hold a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of a story she hadn't known existed. But it was a notebook that held her attention most. She opened it slowly, the pages crackling with age. The handwriting inside was familiar, Sarah's handwriting, but the words were different from anything Emily had ever read before. They were scattered, disjointed, like the thoughts of someone struggling to make sense of their own mind. The words were filled with fear, with confusion, with a deep, aching sadness. Sarah had been trying to make sense of something that had been gnawing at her for a long time. The more Emily read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Sarah had known something about the camp, something that had been hidden from everyone else. There were mentions of strange occurrences, of whispers in the dark, of things that didn't make sense, things that no one else had noticed. Sarah had been trying to uncover the truth, but something had happened. Something had pushed her to the edge, to the point where she felt she had no choice but to leave. The truth was buried in the pages of that notebook, in the words Sarah had written, and now it was in Emily's hands. As the light in the cabin began to fade, Emily closed the notebook, her heart heavy with the weight of the discovery. She had found the truth, Sarah's truth, but it was more complex, more terrifying than she had ever imagined. The camp, the lake, the disappearances, the whispers, it was all part of something much larger, something that no one had seen until now. And Emily realized that this was only the beginning. The secrets of the camp were far from over. They were only just beginning to surface. The weight of the discovery in the cabin settled on Emily's shoulders like a storm cloud, dark and oppressive. She had found the notebook, the photographs, the hidden history of Sarah's fears and suspicions. But it felt like she had only uncovered the first layer of a truth so deep and tangled that it seemed impossible to untangle. The words Sarah had written, the fragmented thoughts, the veiled warnings, were not just the ramblings of someone confused or afraid. They were a roadmap, a map of a place she had once called home, now twisted by secrets and lies. But what had happened to Sarah? Why had she left everything behind to go into hiding? And why had she been so determined to bury the truth, to keep it hidden beneath layers of cryptic notes and half-forgotten memories? As Emily left the cabin, clutching the notebook in her hands, she felt as though the world around her had shifted. The air was thicker now. The trees seemed taller, the lake darker, and every step she took felt like she was walking further into a labyrinth with no clear way out. The edges of the camp were now suffused with an eerie kind of quiet, the kind that precedes a storm, a stillness that seemed to be waiting for something to happen. The ground beneath her feet felt less solid, more uncertain, as if the very foundation of the camp was slowly crumbling away. She had seen the clues, Sarah's notes, her warnings, the strange photo in the box, but they didn't feel like the end of the story. They felt like the beginning of something much darker, something that would change everything. It wasn't just that Sarah had vanished. It was a why that haunted Emily. There was something more beneath the surface of Sarah's disappearance, something that involved the camp, something the other counselors had been blind to, something that no one had noticed until now. The more Emily thought about it, the more she realized that Sarah hadn't been the only one who had known something. In the hours and days since she had started digging into the mystery, she had caught glimpses of things, patterns that hadn't quite made sense before, little moments, things said in passing, strange looks exchanged between some of the staff. It was almost as if they were all playing a part in some unspoken drama, acting out a story whose ending had already been written, except no one was willing to acknowledge it, not even to themselves. As the evening descended, Emily made her way back to the camp's main lodge, the notebook in her hand still warm from her touch. She was determined to find answers, to connect the dots that Sarah had left behind. But as she approached the lodge, she noticed something that made her pause. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to spill out into the darkened grounds. It wasn't like the staff to leave the door open at this hour. The camp had always been strict about security, especially after the storm. There was no reason anyone should be inside now. She approached cautiously, her senses heightened, the feeling of being watched creeping up the back of her neck. Was someone inside? She felt the weight of the notebook pressing into her palms, as though it was a clue that could unlock whatever secret had been buried in the shadows for so long. She took a deep breath, gathered her resolve, and pushed the door open further, slipping inside. The main lodge was dimly lit, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating the wooden floorboards and the long rows of tables where campers once gathered. But the room felt off, the air thick with tension. It was as though the camp had fallen into a kind of suspended animation, frozen in time, a place caught between two worlds. The walls seemed to close in around her as she stepped further inside, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw the figure of someone standing near the back of the room, half hidden in the shadows. Emily's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected anyone to be here. Not at this hour, not after everything that had happened. The figure moved, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw a flash of recognition. It was James, the one person who seemed to understand the weight of the situation, the one person who had shared her concern. But something about the way he stood there, still, tense, watching her, made her second-guess everything. "James!" Emily called out softly, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. "James, is that you?" The silence that followed felt unnerving, like a conversation they had never had, a moment that was stuck between them, heavy and unresolved. Emily took a few cautious steps forward, unsure what she might find. Was he upset? Was he hiding something? Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them felt comforting. Finally, James turned, his face emerging from the shadows, his expression unreadable. "Emily," he said, his voice low, almost guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her voice tight with suspicion. "What's going on, James? Why are you here in the dark?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment he looked weary, tired in a way that went beyond the exhaustion of a long day. "I'm just trying to think, Emily. I'm trying to figure out what we missed. What's been right in front of us all along." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, taking a step closer, trying to make sense of the tension in the room. She could feel the weight of the notebook in her hands, the sense that whatever was happening now, whatever was unfolding, was a turning point in the investigation. James looked away for a moment, his gaze distant. "You're right," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. There's something off about all of this. I've been thinking about it nonstop. Everything we've found, everything we've uncovered. It's like we're being led in circles. The lake, the cabin, the notes, it's all connected. But it doesn't make sense. There's something more here, something no one wants to face. And I'm starting to think that maybe, just maybe, we don't want to find out what that something is. Emily's heart began to pound in her chest. What are you talking about, James? What do you mean we don't want to find out? We have to find the truth. We can't just let this go. Not after everything we've seen, everything we've uncovered. James turned to face her, his eyes searching hers for some kind of understanding. But what if the truth is worse than we think, Emily? What if there's something about this camp, something about Sarah's disappearance, that we're not meant to understand? The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What do you mean? Something we're not meant to understand. We have to know, James. We have to. For Sarah. He stared at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. What if Sarah knew something about this place, about the people here, that we don't? What if she was trying to warn us, trying to protect us from something that's too dangerous to confront? The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows stretching across the walls like dark fingers. Emily felt the weight of the notebook in her hands like a leaden weight. Was this what Sarah had been running from? Was this what had driven her to leave everything behind, to disappear into the night? The answers were just out of reach, slipping away with every word James spoke.